All right, this is my first time giving this talk, so it'll be an adventure. So, is my screen visible, by the way?
Yep, you're good to go.
Cool, wanted to make sure. So, all right, so this is my new research that I've been doing. It is called Outbreak, Virus versus Virus, How We Can Apply Current Legislation and Handling of the COVID-19 Pandemic to the Spread of Malware. So the first question I usually get is, who are you and why do you feel like you're qualified to talk about this kind of stuff? So I'm a graduate of the University of Cincinnati, where I studied neuroscience and psychology, started my career in pharmaceutical development and regulatory compliance, and I led specialized committees targeting phase 1, which is first in human, infectious diseases and emergency research. I still serve on a board as a regulatory and genetic science consultant for NIH studies utilizing recombinant DNA, synthetic nucleic acid molecules, and genetic engineering. I moved to cybersecurity in 2018, and I work as a cloud security engineer in healthcare. I also pen testing sometimes. And this was me putting together this presentation with the society collapsing around us. So first, we will talk about pandemics. So most people do not know the difference between outbreaks and pandemics, so I am going to show you. An outbreak is when there's a greater than anticipated increase in the number of endemic cases of something. Endemic cases are something that happens to a particular people or country. It can also be a single case in a new area. For example, one time this entire family in West Virginia got norovirus gastroenteritis at a family reunion. Supposedly there were 2 different strains caused by 2 different dishes. So grandma's cooking skills apparently run strongly in the family. Anyway, this is what an outbreak is. An epidemic is when a disease affects a large number of people within a community, population, or region. The Zika virus could be considered an epidemic because it affected a large number of people but was not globally widespread. A pandemic is an epidemic that spreads over multiple countries or continents. This would be what we are going through right now. So, is COVID-19 a pandemic? Yes. Yes, it is. I'm sure the map's changed since I made this, but we have had reported cases in the entire green area, so it is spreading and it's touched most of the world at this point. So let's look at the history of pandemics. Just as far as the 10 worst go, so we can look at trends. The Antonine Plague was a pandemic that broke out around 165 AD, and it was either smallpox or measles, we don't really know. It was brought back to Rome by soldiers returning from Mesopotamia, and it killed roughly 5 million people. We also have the plague of Justinian, which happened in 541 to 542. This was the bubonic plague. It killed 25 million. It's thought to have offed half of the population of Europe at the time. The Black Death was also the bubonic plague. Not sure how many people it killed exactly, but between 75 and 200 million. They believe it to be spread via fleas and rats. The third cholera pandemic occurred between 1852 and 1860 and was found to be due to contaminated water, killed around 1 million people. Flu pandemic of 1889 was a subtype of H3N8. It killed over 1 million people. The sixth cholera pandemic occurred in 1910 and killed roughly 800,000 people. Because the US had learned from the past, they were able to isolate the infected and only 11 deaths occurred in the US. The 1918 flu pandemic was an oddly deadly flu virus with a mortality rate of 10 to 20%. It killed between 20 and 50 million people. Next, we have the Asian flu, which is an H2N2 subtype. It mostly affected areas in Asia. It took out roughly 2 million people between 1956 and 1958. The 1968 flu pandemic was an H3N2 subtype and took only 17 days to spread across Asia and 3 months to reach worldwide. It killed roughly 1 million. And finally, the peak of the HIV/AIDS pandemic was from 2005 to 2012. While it's now manageable with treatment, it took over 36 million lives since 1981. So what can we learn from these? Looking at all these, we can ascertain a few things. One, a main concern is containing the spread of a virus, especially between continents. It's a skill we have not yet mastered. We also have learned that many of the recurring infections are mutations. These are very common among viruses, which we will talk about a little bit later. Oftentimes they're made of RNA and not DNA, therefore they are less stable and more prone to mistakes. Because viruses do not have a proofreading step at the end of replication when they're made of RNA, the mistakes often lead to a mutation. Finally, we see a lot of repetitiveness. There are certain strains that are hardier and can easily become recurrent year after year. So now we can talk about cyber attacks. So malware campaigns. You all most likely know what malware is, but I will briefly touch on it. Malware is a malicious software, which is basically an umbrella term to describe malicious programs or code that is harmful to systems. It's like a termite. It tries to invade, damage, or disable systems, networks, etc. Malware can be like a biological virus in that it interferes with regular functioning of a system. Malware is spread in a few ways. One of the most common is via email, people clicking on things they shouldn't, for the most part. Attackers can be super good at making things look like they're coming from legitimate senders. There are also types of malware that exploit system vulnerabilities, causing users to inadvertently put malware on their machines. It can also be spread directly via USB, etc. Here is an example, the Emotet infection chain. This is a nasty version of malware that has been around for a while, and it's usually exploited by links to malicious Word documents or attached malicious Word documents. So in contrast to the worst pandemic viruses, here are some of the worst malware and or massive data breaches that have struck around the world. We have Stuxnet, which was created by the US government in Israel. It was a worm that was used in 2010. It was the first malware to physically damage equipment. So it targeted Microsoft Windows and located Siemens Step 7 in order to manipulate PLCs. Shamoon was developed by Iranian state-backed hackers. The Windows wiper was used in 2012 in an attack against oil company Saudi Aramco and works by collecting a computer's data before wiping and destroying the master boot record, effectively bricking the computer. We had the Sony hack, which was a group calling themselves Guardians of Peace, and they attacked Sony Pictures Entertainment in 2014, stealing 100 terabytes of data, deleting files and configurations, and later releasing the stolen sensitive information. There was an OPM management breach, a series of breaches orchestrated by China in 2013 and 2014 against the Office of Personnel Management. That was more just hackers than it was malware. Ukrainian blackouts, a suite of malware that stole credentials, allowed the hackers to gain access and mainly turn off circuit breakers and cause a blackout. Shadow Brokers, which was a hacker group that released an extensive collection of the National Security Agency's tools, including the Microsoft Windows exploit Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue branched into WannaCry, which was its whole own adventure. There was the 2016 US presidential hack, lots of email phishing attacks in that. We have NotPetya, which was developed by a Russian hacking group, Sandworm, was destructive malware built to lock down computers, devastate networks, create chaos, essentially. There was the Equifax breach, which again was a lot of phishing attacks to begin with. And then Aadhaar, which was an Indian government identification database that was breached as well. So now that we've gone through the two histories, what are the similarities? So most of you are probably familiar with the life cycle of a computer virus. So I want to bring up to speed on the life cycle of a human virus. We have 4 stages here: entry, replication, shedding, and latency. During entry, a virus must enter cells of the host organism and use those cells' materials, much like a computer virus needs a host. Next, a virus must take control of the host cell's replication mechanisms. It is at this stage a distinction between susceptibility and permissibility of a host cell is made. Permissibility determines the outcome of the infection. After control is established and the environment is set for the virus to begin making copies of itself, replication occurs quickly. After a virus has made many copies of itself, the progeny may begin to leave the cell by several methods. This is called shedding and is the final stage in the virus life cycle. Some viruses can also hide within a cell, and that may mean they evade the host cell defenses or immune system and can increase the long-term success of the virus. The hiding is deemed latency. During this time, the virus does not produce any progeny, remains inactive until external stimuli, such as light or stress, prompt it to activate. Now that we've covered that, we can look at similarities. During the entry phase for the biological virus, the virus enters cells of the host organism and uses the cell material. Similarly, with the computer virus, it has accessed target user's computer or software. During replication, they both take control of the replication mechanism and begin to propagate. During the shedding phase, the biological virus leaves the cell or host, while the computer virus is triggered and executed, potentially spreading. Finally, they both have latency periods where the virus can remain idle or hide. There are other similarities as well. Computer viruses target specific entities, as do biological viruses when they seek out host cells. They both technically contain executable code as well. The biological virus has genetic code that can be transcribed and translated. They both have specificity for what target, i.e. an operating system versus what kind of species a virus would target. And finally, they have different degrees of harmfulness or virulence. So from the life cycle, we can do vector analysis. We do vector analysis with attacks, but did you know we use vectors with viruses as well? In the biological sciences, a vector is anything that can pass an infection to another organism. Here we have a diagram of some of the good ways we use vectors. We remove cells from a patient, then alter a virus so that it cannot reproduce. We insert a gene into the virus, then we grow similar cells that are also genetically altered. The altered cells are injected into the patient and produce the desired protein or hormone. This is used often in oncology treatments and the like. Similarly, a vector, when talking about malicious code, is the method that the code uses to propagate itself or infect a computer. When we look at the spread of a pandemic, we use maps to visualize data and the location of the spread of the disease. With malware, there are some companies that offer live data, but it does bring about the question of why we don't map malware spread the way we do with pandemic spread. With the current virus, we've seen a lot of open source and live data sets that are available. This is pretty unprecedented as we haven't had the technology to do this in the past. This is the first pandemic we've had in a while. With malware, again, more data collection is being done with the prevalence of malware in innocuous looking apps, etc. However, there is still a great shortage of data analysis surrounding malware campaigns, especially the more public ones. With pandemics, there's dedicated entities like the CDC and World Health Organization that have specific units and teams dedicated to continued monitoring of pandemic and outbreak spread. This provides constant information on the spread and handling of a pandemic. Again, with malware, there are lots of tools for monitoring current attacks by private companies. But is there a case to be made for watchdog and spread monitoring on a government or even worldwide level for these? So now we'll look at the way that we respond to pandemics. The National Pandemic Strategy is composed of 3 pillars. First pillar is preparedness and communication. This is the epitome of planning for a pandemic. The governing body will set community expectations and assign responsibilities, produce and stockpile vaccines, antivirals, or treatments, establish distribution plans for those treatments, and continue to advance scientific knowledge and accelerate the development of breakthroughs and other novel treatment. The second pillar is surveillance and detection. This should sound familiar, especially if you're in incident response. This pillar focuses on ensuring rapid reporting of outbreaks to both public health entities and citizens, and using surveillance to limit the spread of a virus. Finally, the third pillar is response and containment. This focuses on containing outbreaks, leveraging national medical and public health surge capacity, sustaining infrastructure, essential services, and the economy, and ensuring effective, consistent risk communication. So here we just have a little bit of a comparison. The World Health Organization, so on a global scale, how we respond to pandemics versus on a federal government in the US response stages. There's a lot of overlap between these. The federal government one is actually a little bit more complex because it is analyzing overseas as well as outbreaks specifically in the United States. So next, we can compare that with our malware and data breach responses. The National Cyber Incident Response Plan describes a national approach to dealing with cyber incidents, addresses the important role that the private sector, state and local governments, and multiple federal agencies play in the responding to incidents and how all actions fit together for an integrated response. This plan was built off of lessons from exercises, real world happenings, and policy updates like the National Cybersecurity Protection Act of 2014. Built on lessons, the NCIRP also serves as the cyber annex to the federal interagency operational plan that built upon the national planning frameworks and the national preparedness system. This plan applies to cyber incidents and more specifically, significant cyber incidents that are likely to result in demonstrable harm to the national security interests, foreign relations, or economy of the United States, or to public confidence, civil liberties, or public health and safety of Americans. The plan has 5 guiding principles. They should sound pretty familiar, especially compared to the pandemic plan. They are shared responsibility, risk-based response, respecting affected entities, unity of governmental effort, and enabling restoration and recovery. The NCIRP does have a relationship with the National Preparedness System, which covers a broader architecture that establishes how the community is to prevent, protect against, mitigate, respond to, and recover from all threats and hazards. When we further break down the capabilities of an affected entity, we see these more specific efforts that cover a broad range of activities. So here we have threat and hazard ID, logistics and supply chain management, which is often kind of an afterthought at this point, operations communications, public information and warning. So it's a little bit more granular in terms of the process by which we could respond. And finally, we have application. So let's take a look at the current situation that we're dealing with. If you haven't heard of the novel coronavirus, I don't know where you've been. But we have this insane virus that is similar to SARS rolling around the world. And it's been extremely interesting to see what the response has been like. We can break the response to the virus by the United States into 4 phases. First, the virus was conveyed as being of low risk to Americans. Screening at airports was implemented if they had travelers from affected countries. Second, a task force comprised of different agencies was formed, a public health emergency was declared, and it became clear based on the data from other countries that the effectiveness of a response depended on the testing capabilities of the local entities. Failure to test at large scale kept the data available to the public at a low number. Third, the CDC decided to widen the testing criteria as testing capacity expanded, and the FDA began to issue retroactive approval for non-standard testing, which is super unusual. The travel ban was expanded and a supplemental appropriation bill was passed. Finally, the 4th phase, which is the phase that we're currently in, there's been a declaration of a national emergency and a broadened testing ability is starting to reveal true numbers. So what can we learn from the handling so far of the coronavirus? Based on the current situation and response, we've got quite a few things to go over here. First, time is of essence in both responses. The longer it takes to implement a response plan, either in a biological virus situation or in a data breach or malware situation, the farther the infection can potentially spread. Second, transparency is also extremely important and has been lacking in some of the incident response measures when it comes to a breach or attack. Ensuring that data is up to date, accurate, and widely available will assist not only affected entities, but others that are potentially facing the same attack in the future and trying to secure against it. Adequate resources are another must. Removing any bottlenecks when it comes to testing or detection can shorten response time and prevent spread of infection. Proper analysis of the agent or the executable is absolutely required in order to determine the cause of the virus, the vectors, remember, and how to mitigate it both in the current moment and in the future. Monitoring is another area where we can definitely improve incident response. There's been so much data available mapping and monitoring the spread of COVID-19, and it can be extremely prudent to do the same with widespread known malware attacks. Finally, education is paramount. You've seen so many articles and signs and commercials telling people to wash their hands and wear face masks, etc., in order to avoid spread and contraction of this virus. Many security incidents can be avoided by educating the user and making sure they know the risks and how to avoid an infection or a data breach. So let's apply what we've learned from pandemic response to a security incident. Here we have COVID, a Trojan that is primarily spread through mail spam. This can arrive either via malicious script, macro-enabled document files, or malicious links. COVID will ransack your contact list and send itself to your friends, family, coworkers, and clients. Since the emails are coming from your hijacked email account, they look less like spam. So the recipients, feeling safe, are more inclined to click bad URLs and download infected files. If a connected network is present, COVID will spread using a list of common passwords, oftentimes guessing its way onto other connected systems in a brute force attack. If it continues to spread, it can cause damage worldwide amounting to millions of dollars. So first, let's say your corporation picks up on some suspected COVID infections. Let's also say that this is a cool, perfect world and there is a World Health Organization, but for information security incidents. When large company detects this infection, they can notify the global reporting authority of the case. The authority tracking all reported cases can gauge at what point there is enough spread to warrant an emergency. While this is happening, researchers can go to work. They begin to outline the causes of infections and how we can potentially remediate these eventually. Think the genetic reverse engineering of the COVID virus, the researchers trying to develop vaccines and cures, etc. They will also disseminate this information publicly so users can begin to understand how they can prevent this attack from happening in the future. Finally, once the spread begins to slow and business returns to normal, the reporting authority will continue to globally monitor the spread of these infections. Oftentimes, they do recur, and it would be helpful to keep track of the spikes and resurgences as they occur so they're better handled. So my question here is, how much time, data, and money could we save by responding to a malware like a pandemic? Some future implications here: communication, more effective communication to consumers; resources, better preparation and structure for IR; mitigation, proper steps and preparedness for remediation; and monitoring, global and visual widespread monitoring. So my conclusions here: from the first true global pandemics, the need for awareness has become apparent. If the same easily accessible information was pushed as publicly for malware campaigns, the impact could be lessened and the average user would become more literate in cyber threats as a byproduct. The containment of spread is another lesson that has been learned. Through the flu pandemic in 1968, the flu pandemic in 1918, and the current COVID-19 pandemic, it's become apparent that a main concern is containing the spread of the virus, especially between continents. Once proliferating, it's easy for the number of cases to spread exponentially. We see this in malware also, and it's worth looking at the ways in which we contain the spread of biological viruses and whether these can be applied to mitigation of malware spread. Mutations are extremely common in biological viruses, and this can be the same in the spread of malware, albeit by intent. The same viruses can come back in different forms, slightly tweaked or with a different execution. We also see repeats very often. By looking at the way the strains of the flu, especially subtypes H2N2 and H3N8, continue to recur, we can draw many parallels among the recurrence of malware. What changes in the world climate cause the same types of malware to be brought out of retirement? And how can we potentially track this similarly to the statistical recurrence of biological viruses? And finally, there could be great value added in malware and data breach incident response if we further examine the pandemic responses and work as a whole to apply some of the transparencies and data collection methods that are utilized, among other things. And a couple minutes early, but that is all I have for today. So thank you, everyone. I will be around afterwards for questions if anyone has them.
All right, thank you. So first question, do you have a blog?
Um, I kind of do. Like I have a site where I post things sometimes, but I haven't actually like shared it with anyone. It's more just like random ramblings that I figured like once I build up enough articles, maybe I'll make it public eventually. But yeah, I mean, I guess I wasn't sure what kind of stuff people would want to see. Would they want to see more of the um, biology background or the tech stuff or a mixture of both? I just haven't nailed down the audience on that one. So if anyone has suggestions, I'm more than open to them.
Well, how about in the meantime, I share your Twitter account and folks can follow you up there. And when you are
Perfect.
ready to announce the world premiere of the Gabby blog, you heard it
Perfect.
here first. All right. Was thinking why H2N2 and H3N8 are so persistent and recurring. What is it about them that makes them so hardy?
You know, that is a good question. And it's something that I actually questioned while I was putting this together, but I didn't get to look into it super in depth yet. But my guess is that, you know, there are certain mutations that will make it harder for a virus to survive once it's in its host. And there are certain mutations that will make it easier for it to survive and multiply. Maybe, you know, less temperature sensitive or less sensitive to certain conditions. So I'm assuming that those, since they continue to come back, we see them constantly, not constantly, but, you know, every few years they seem to rear their heads. I would think that it's probably just because those viruses have, they mutated to the point where they are just hard to get rid of, and they're able to survive in a lot of different conditions.
Do you think a GDPR style mandatory report of data breach can help in the first part of this pandemic style strategy?
I think that could be something interesting to talk about, definitely. I know GDPR, a lot of people are iffy about it. It can be really, really strict in its definitions of identifiable information and things like that. But I think, you know, mandatory reporting to some extent could be good. It would offer a little bit of transparency when it came to data breaches and things along those lines, just so other companies know what to look out for.
Is there a way to properly inoculate an environment the way we inoculate against biologic issues?
If there was, we would be so good at what we do, or we might not have jobs. So I don't know. Um, it would be super cool if we could almost make vaccines for environments. I don't know how I would necessarily go about engineering that, but I think it could be a really cool idea to explore.
Well, it is the reason why antivirus was the name of the original security products that were pushed out on host computers.
True.
That's actually a talk that I've been giving for several years, talking about the challenges we have with, and not, I haven't termed it in the phrase inoculation, but inoculation is certainly a part of it, which
Hmm.
is you have this combination of what's my ability to protect at the host level, detect at the host and network level for response. All right.
Do you have a recording of that? Will you send it to me?
Yeah, I have several. I'll have to find the
Cool.
latest one.
Yeah,
Remind
I
me.
definitely want that for sure.
Hatch the herd. So that's funny, Stuart. Part of my talk is I talk about the concept, not on that talk, but another talk on IoT. I talk about the concept of herd immunity, where IoT devices, particularly being so pervasive in the environment, create infinitely or exponentially more surface area for lateral and vectors in. Um, So final comment that I think is relevant here. It seems like transparency is the weakest part of response, pandemic or otherwise.
I definitely agree with that. I think it's not necessarily, I don't want to say it's shame, but I think a lot of companies are reluctant to say, hey, we've had this data breach. This is how it happened. And they don't want to, I guess, publicize the weaknesses or, lose any other customers or clients' trust. And it's kind of the same with pandemics. I mean, there are a lot of countries that just don't want to be like, hey, everyone here's infected. So that's a problem. I mean, yeah, I don't know why there's such a stigma with it, but it could be, I think transparency would actually help a lot in terms of incident response and prevention.
Two other talks to check out on that topic were Wendy Nather was talking about the CISO perspective. So there's a lot of public relations and market value concerns. I mean, there are instances where there are compliance and regulatory reasons why you can't disclose something. And so her talk, which all these will be published in about a month, covers that side. And then the other side, we had Casey Ellis talking about how hackers are the immune system, to quote Karen Elazari, of the internet. And so he was talking about Disclose.io, which was setting up vulnerability disclosure programs to help, essentially have those antibodies help you.
And that was definitely one I wanted to catch too, so I can't wait to see that one.
All right, well, Gap will be in Discord to answer any more questions. And we will have Dave Kennedy coming on shortly for the final keynote to close out GRIMMCon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Gap.